This is Centaur here, and today we are continuing in our series looking at the Commander's Compendium for Bolt Action, put out by David Hasselfeld and Bo Mortensen. And today we're looking at their scenario called Timely Objectives. So we've been looking at kind of different plays on objective control, key position style things with the pin grid video, the tic-tac-toe video, and now we're looking at timely objectives. Okay, and so we're going to be looking at what the victory conditions are, which units I think might perform a little bit better, although I'll be honest, basically all of them perform pretty well, with maybe one or two exceptions in this scenario. The scenario really does cater to a lot of different ways to win. You just have to have a very clear plan, and you got to dedicate and devote and commit and execute on that in order to make that win. We will take a look a little bit at units likely to struggle, but honestly, there aren't that many. And then we'll look at some deployment and terrain considerations to help you maximize the force that you have brought. So to start off with, in terms of the overview, first of all, there's no infiltration on this one. So everybody will be starting in their deployment zone. They will not be able to start ahead of that. Kind of important for how the whole objective thing works for this one, so it kind of makes sense. You can outflank on this, which I think is great. I don't think it throws the game into a loop. I don't think it makes it haphazard at all. But the way this works is that there are going to be three 25mm objectives on the center line. And players are going to alternate placing those three on the center line. They can technically be placed anywhere. They're not at set positions like we saw in the last two scenarios. Instead, they do have to be, like beyond 6 inches of a board edge and beyond 12 inches of each other. But beyond that, you can technically place them anywhere along that center line. So don't worry if, the middle is completely empty. If you get that first placement, you can place it further to the left, further to the right. And even if you have the last one you got to place, you don't have to place it smack dab in the center. You can center it either way as long as you're beyond 12 inches of another objective, beyond 6 inches of an edge. I again assume that infantry and artillery getting within 3 inches will control it if it is not if it's uncontested. It doesn't specify it, but I just assume that's how it works in this pack as we have for all the others. So I'm just going to continue assuming that as time goes on. At the end of turn 2 and onwards, at the end of the turn, you look to see who has control of which objective, and they score 1 victory point for each of those that they control. And so at the end of turn 2, they'll score, turn 3, they'll score, so on and so forth. This means that since all the models start in the deployment zone, this is not first wave deployment. Okay, this is long board edge deployment. Swift claiming probably matters even more because technically, an infantry squad running forward from starting right, not even on the line of the deployment zone. They can be up to 2 to 3 inches back because they just got to get within that 3 inches, right, in order to control it. They can get it, right? So, having faster units does help, and, we'll talk about that later. But just suffice it to say for now, getting, a transport with a big squad that can actually survive, mounted infantry, something that can move up, claim it, and actually hold it, because you don't want the opponent rolling up with a bunch of submachine guns, blowing you off, and because they're within 3 inches because they jumped out of a transport, they then take it and now it's theirs. And, because they're veterans with submachine guns, they're going to be really hard to dig out of wherever it is that you got them. Like that could be problematic. So you really want a squad that can survive. Okay. And then after you've done that, you want to remove threats, not because you're going to score victory points for it. There's no victory points for unit removal, which is different from pin grid and from tic-tac-toe, which we've been looking at recently. It means you're mostly removing the threats just so they cannot control the objective. Okay, you're going to try to just remove units that could potentially try to challenge you for actually, contesting and then later on controlling that objective spot. And I think really the trick with this one is you really want to try to end up with at least 7 victory points by the end of turn 4. So after you've scored 3 times, in an ideal world, you would want 2 to 3 victory points each, because at that point you're in a pretty solid lead. You're probably going to do okay. You can only score a maximum of 15 points for this entire scenario because you have 5 rounds of scoring. I guess if it goes to a 7th round, you'd have a 6. You could have up to 18 points. But, assuming only 6 rounds that you're playing, you'd only have scoring at the ends of rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you can only score 3 points total per round, 1 for each objective. So if you can get to 7 by the end of turn 4, and they only have 2 turns to try to get 8, they would already have 2. They would have to take all 3 objectives and hold all 3 objectives and score all 3 objectives both of those turns. So all you'd have to do is hold on to 1. You could literally pull back your forces from every objective, save one, hold that one for one turn, and then you could run back to your deployment zone if you wanted to because the game is yours. Okay. Obviously, winning by 2 or more, you would need to do a little bit better than that, right? Ideally. But even, if you have 7 by the end of turn 4, all you'd have to do is camp around one objective, score it twice, and you're done, right? Because then the most they could get is 6, and you'd have 9, and then you'd win. And even if it goes to turn 3, if you score it one more time, then you'd have 10 and they'd have 8, and you'd still have 2 or more, which means you would still win, right? So the big advantage, I think, going into this strategically is if you can get 7 or more by the end of turn 4, that's ideally what you would want. There are obviously other ways to win, but I think that's the safety zone, the good net you'd want to have so that you're not fighting really intensely all the way up to the buzzer. In terms of high performance units, obviously big squads are going to be helpful here. If you're running a squad of 6, 7, 8-man veterans or even larger, I suppose, those will be very difficult to dislodge. 8 to 9-man squads, maybe even 10-man squads of regulars would also be really hard to dislodge just because it would probably require them to do more than drop one unit on you, shoot you up, and then move on. It would probably require 2 units shooting at you, and that means that it gets a little tricky, a little more dicey in terms of how they go about trying to activate the units and choosing when to shoot at you. So, you want to have something big and durable that's going to hold on to it. Transports are going to be very useful, not only because they help to move up men, they help to screen objective holding units afterwards, right? So, if they roll up, you don't have to run them short and then drop the men to go in front of them. You could run that transport, especially if you have, a wheeled vehicle on a road or even a half-track vehicle on a road. You could roll it past where you'd actually want your men to be, turn it so that way, sure, they get a side shot, they remove it. Who cares? You don't get any victory points for removing units in this room, right? But turning it so that way you get that heavy cover or soft cover depending on the level of armor of your transport, and then the men can hop out from behind it, and now they've got cover and protection. And if the transport gets destroyed, it is now a wreck, so it's impassable terrain, and it's heavy cover for you. Right? So it's still doing its job. It didn't even cough up any victory points. And your men are a little bit safer. Better chance you're going to win. So transports. I think transports really, really useful, especially the whole cover theory on transports that we talked about in our transport series. Light armor, unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk about this. Light armor is very good. It's very affordable firepower. You need to be able to remove units, both of the vehicle variety and of the infantry variety, and light armor tends to be a relatively, cost-effective way of being able to do that. And again, because you're not coughing up victory points for losing them, it's not like you're losing VPs if somebody walks up with a really big armored vehicle and they're taking out your light vehicles one at a time. As long as you can still claim the objectives, and as long as you can protect the men that are holding it for you, it doesn't matter whether they get blown up, right? So suddenly being DV7, being DV8, being DV7 armored topped, open topped, it doesn't matter as much because the vehicle's still doing its job, right? In helping to remove units, and then once it's gone, it's cover for everybody else. But similarly, heavy armor is also very useful here because if you can take it, especially first activation, first turn, if you can take an objective or 2, depending on if you have like a company commander that then snaps guys and then those guys roll out and you take 2 objectives, if you can then roll a big DV9, DV10 tank onto that objective, taking that objective from you is going to be a whole lot harder. Right? And worst case scenario, it advances a little bit further up on the second turn, starts shooting at some stuff. Maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't. Who cares? The important thing is now it's even more cover for the infantry that are within range to claim the objective. Right? So you've got a bunch of different options. You might even consider with a heavy tank, especially if it has a slow property, of just giving it the run order on the first turn. Since you're taking that advance penalty and you're looking at like 5s to hit, best case scenario, it's not like you're going to hit that much anyway with a heavy tank. Like unless you took like the DV10 version, the command vehicle version of the Char 2C, you're probably not going to hit that many things. You're not even going to do that many pins. So it might even be worth it to just roll it forward, roll your veteran KV1 straight up there onto an objective and just basically say, fight me, right, for the whole game. And I think that could be very effective. Similarly, artillery, machine gun teams, and mortars, these are just very cheap and relatively efficient ways to suppress enemy units, prepare enemy objectives for your troops, making sure that enemies that are going to be trying to rebuff you are going to be pinned. They might be missing a bunch of men, so they're not going to be taking as many shots. You might even remove some of the smaller units that people throw onto objectives just to help make it a little bit easier for that final clearing unit to make sure that there's nobody within 3 inches when they end their activation. All of that, I think, will be very, very useful. In terms of units likely to struggle, honestly, there are not very many. Most units have a place. Even small squads, multiple small unit style or MSU style builds, while they weren't as helpful on things like, pin grid or tic tac toe, they actually are perhaps a little more useful here because if you have two or three of them all running up onto an objective and they're just kind of hanging out there, and the enemy has to pick each one of them off one at a time. And they can choose to go down because, hey, who cares? I got other units that can do the job of pinning and removing enemies. I don't have to use these guys to do it. I mean, those could actually be relatively beefy, relatively tanky for the purpose of securing these. And the fact that there's only three means that if you're running an MSU build, you can easily dedicate 4 or 5 units even to a given objective, and half of them could go down, and it's now congratulations, it's still yours, right? So like there are even ways to do that. I think there are maybe more advanced or more difficult ways to do it in terms of what units to choose. I do think potentially multiple rocket launchers might struggle in this one, only because since they're on the center line and roughly how far they can be both from each other and from the edges, there aren't too many places where you can place all three objectives. And I highly suspect with that 36-inch minimum range that you might only be able to get units that are protecting one objective in range of you. And because of the fact that we tend to see a lot more terrain, and especially line of sight blocking terrain nowadays, because of how cover saves work and how essential they are for making sure that you aren't just wiped off the board. Being able to see very much, even with the help of a spotter, even a spotter is not going to add that much to your line of sight because he's going to be blocked off by certain things that he just can't see over, right? So I suspect that there very well could be a potential downside to taking multiple rocket launchers on this particular one, but that'd be like the one unit that I think is actually likely to struggle. Everything else could work, especially if you practice and you get good at it and you have a clear plan on how you want to use whatever army you're taking. Okay. So in terms of deployment and terrain considerations, a couple of things to think about. One last thing we should talk about because of what we're, how we discussed earlier, how deployment is dice in bag for units, not in reserve draw dice to set up units. This means the Italian special rule, which I got wrong in the last two videos, mea culpa on that one, because now all first wave units get to ignore the Italian special rule. The Italian special rule is not ignored the way this is written. And that means you really are probably going to want transports to move your men up, because otherwise you're going to be limited to a 6-inch move for dismounted infantry, a 9-inch move for mounted up infantry, or transport-based movement for infantry that are inside the transport, right? And then they jump out after that. So transports, I think, are going to be even more important on this one. Technically speaking, a 9-inch move cavalry squad or a 12-inch move advance on a, what's it called? On a motorcycle could get you within range of the objective because presumably the objective is larger than a millimeter on that center line. And so it's 3 inches that extend out from that marker would mean that a 9-inch move model or definitely a 12-inch move model could break within the seal and thus on the first turn, first activation, could flip an objective to you. Now, that being said, as we look at terrain considerations, getting a straight beeline toward an objective may not be so easy because there's going to be cover present, right? There's going to be things that are probably going to slow most units down unless you're, one of those blessed armies that gets fieldcraft, for example, on all of your infantry on turn 1, right? Or something like that, which means, I guess you could drive a motorcycle even through a forest or through a ruin and get it out there if you have the infiltrator keyword. I think it's like maybe the Dutch and the Poles. I know Poland gets motorcycle infantry and fieldcraft. I feel like maybe the Dutch do, but I don't know for sure. Help me out down in the comments below. It might just be like Poland. I think about it. Reason not to run cavalry, run 10th motorized. Because, hey, you can get up there nice and quick, even on turn 1. Even if you're playing against the Italians. Okay, so just things to keep in mind. Italy is going to be a little bit of a trickier one to deal with. They might get up on the objectives first. You got to pound them off if they do that. And so toward that end, plan your advance around your central cover. Okay, you need to be able to protect your units when they're on these objectives. It might even mean pushing past the center line toward the enemy because maybe that's where the really good cover is on a specific objective. Maybe that's why they chose to place the objective over in that area. So, make plans for that. Also plan on deployment zone cover because you're probably going to have some supporting fire units that don't need to rush all the way up. artillery, mortars, machine gun teams, things like that. Potentially even snipers, really, because remember, snipers don't get forward deployment on this one, right? They don't get to infiltrate. So you're gonna be planning around that stuff to keep them safe while giving them good, clear lines of attack that you're not gonna clog up with your own models because you need it to be nice and clear for them, unless it's a mortar, in which case indirect fire means they can run right underneath of where the shells are coming in. That's fine. But make sure you've got your plans from protection. That's where you want your angles to come from. Okay. In terms of reserves, and this is actually going to surprise almost nobody because there's a lot of times I don't put anybody in reserve. In general, I wouldn't do this. In my opinion, just get your boys up the board quickly, with one exception. Okay. You don't want to end up with a situation where you wish you had more units to move on to an objective to flip it to your control on turn 1 or even turn 2 and find that you don't have it because you had to bring them in from reserve, which is further away than the very, very edge of your deployment zone, or you didn't roll well enough for them to come in from reserve, so now they're pushed back to coming in on a future turn. You don't want to cough up points early because of that, because an early lead could be what gives you the victory later. Now, there's one exception. If you do end up outflanking units, that could be a highly effective way of getting past some of the enemy's defensive positions, taking units out, and ensuring that on turns 3, 4, and 5, you're scoring for an objective that you otherwise might not have scored for. If that's the case, that could swing the game. So, as somebody who didn't outflank much in 2nd edition, I'm finding outflanking to be a lot more useful in 3rd edition, and scenarios like this do make it advantageous because, as you'll notice, objectives are not always placed an equidistant amount from each other. They're not always placed an equidistant amount from the side. So in this case, if I'm player A, because that's how I'd be looking at it if I was playing on the board, my right flank, that objective is pretty close to my right side, right? The right short board edge. And so if I choose to outflank my units from that board edge, that could be a highly, highly effective way to swoop some guys in, drop them out of a transport, clear out the whole place, and then stake that objective. And then starting from turn 3 onwards, maybe that one's just mine. The enemy doesn't have enough units in the area to contest that. Maybe I deployed a lot more of my force heavier on the left-hand side. So my opponent thought, well, I only need 2 or 3 units on the right-hand side, on my opponent's right-hand flank in order to take and clear that objective. And so they camp on it. Maybe you even, give them some token resistance to make it look like you're trying to fight for it. And then on turn 3, you swoop in with your outflankers, you clear that out, and the enemy puts so much of their emphasis elsewhere that they have problems getting guys over to that side in order to take it back from you, right? Outflanking, I think, could be very, very useful for that, okay? Roads, because I will just drill this in literally every video, okay, just in case, because I don't know if you're new to the channel. Plan your road access for your half-track and wheeled vehicles. Tracked vehicles should not be on roads, okay? Unless you really need to get somebody up and you really need the space for it, okay? In general, half-tracks and wheeled vehicles on roads. If you have a mix of vehicles, some of which get doubled movement and some of which do not, you got to work with this, okay? Obviously, you want to make sure that your transports can get where they need to go with the pivots they have. You want to make sure that your attack vehicles still have their lines of sight and proper firing lanes, that they're not going to, you're not giving cover through other stuff, right? So, like there's things to think about. But as much as possible, preserve your roads. You're going to need that because not only is it going to be helpful for making sure you can get guys to the objective as early as you want to with the pivots that you need in order to make the maneuver, but also it could be useful for pushing even deeper because in many respects, if all of the objectives are on the center line, one of the best defenses for these objectives is a good offense. Being able to move even further up and push, push, push so that they're really fighting from their deployment zone in order to even get out of it. I mean, that could be the game for you, right? Because you wouldn't have to hold for very long. 2 turns, and then you could afford to kind of start scaling back. By turn 4, you're already starting to scale back. By turn 5, you're scaling back to just the 1, and you've got them, right? So, make sure you've got the roads. It gives you access for really, really deep strikes into the enemy, okay? The name of the game on this one is quick and stick. Get on the objective first, stay there, push the enemy off if you can, and then once it's solidly yours, move up other units to maintain that may not be as good at pushing people off objectives and move on to the next objective. Keep the push, keep the pressure going to make sure that you've got the 3 objectives, okay? Also, concentrate your efforts. If you're spending a lot of different shots trying to work down all 3 of the objectives, you might find you're not going to score on hardly any of them, maybe not even any of them on a given turn. Focus on them. This one is mine. Contest this one, fight it hard, make sure that there's a fighting chance that you're staking 2. and then move on. Make sure that you've got a second one under your control. Make sure that you're fortifying and protecting the one you already have. Push hard. You could stay there. You could let them have the third one for the rest of the game. You don't need to push it. But if you do continue pushing it, there's a very good chance that the enemy isn't going to have the resources to be able to try to take the other ones from you. Okay? And watch out for those outflankers. Don't get distracted by only what's on the board. I've lost games because of that. And so, in my opinion, I think that's the best way to go in terms of taking the stuff on. Have a plan, build around, I only need 2. Be nice to push for 3. If I can sneak away to get number 3, even sneaking 1 or 2 points that my opponent thought they had could be really useful. And so that's my opinion on how best to go about doing the timely objectives scenario. What do you think? Do you think that there should be a secondary victory objective scoring mechanism? I don't. I think it's actually pretty fine to do it this way. Is it good that you're scoring every turn, or should it just be scored at the end of the game? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.